Okay. I'm going to go through some comments to a video of mine I called something like "Consciousness is not just about processing information and generating behavior." This is my own comment display system on my personal helper website thing that I stopped working on because I didn't like developing for Google App Engine anymore. Okay, starting from this comment here, but really we're just working down to go from this thread under here, but I want to give you on account of Vod's message, but I want to give you the context, so I won't read all of these messages in between, but we'll go down most of them actually. Okay, so Coax said, my own speculation, I think language has a lot to do with it. We create symbols and stories for those symbols, and the neocortex is now so complex the brain can create a story for itself in the I node. Maybe even this symbol system in the neurons is what enables us to be more conscious too. We are told all our lives we are an individual, and we learn others are individuals through this language, and our brain creates the story with the pattern recognizer neocortex. Fine, but how we get this subjective, the so-called, the Chalmers problem there, the hard problem. And I say language is the ability to apply metaphor to connect by short circuit elements of one domain to another, possibly very different domain. It's the cross-wiring. It looks to have evolved by integrating different sense and motor functions to have a very arbitrary ability to relate things. And Coax says, yeah, so it could be that all of this consciousness business comes merely from that ability to arbitrarily relate things, maybe the physical locations and natural barriers the brain observes in objects and in people enabled the I and phenomena to occur. Something along those lines is what I'm thinking of, but it's hard to describe. And I reply, the behavior of consciousness may come from that, but feeling conscious, I don't see how that comes from just information processing, insofar as a computer that did the required information processing would still not feel aware of its actions. To which Anna Kantavad made a comment that created this huge thread between him and Coax. You can see each one of these lines is a depth to the thread, so it gets the reply chain gets quite deep. Right, it goes on and then finally ends there. And I intervened a little bit, and that's the point of this video. So Anna Kantavad at that point says, if I is enabled, what is being enabled to be an I? What you are describing is, in my opinion, very similar to a religious creation myth. Coax says, religious creation myth is kind of over the top, isn't it? I'm trying to come from this from a physical perspective. And yet, speculation. What's enabling the I would be the brain's ability to organize and perceive sensory input, and the brain's ability to refine that input with written language. Language seems like it adds whole new levels, since we can reinterpret raw consciousness rather than just perceiving it. I happen to think that animals can do this without language as we understand it. I believe there's like a language of dreams where, a cigar might just be a cigar, it might mean something else. And that kind of language, I think, is spread throughout at least the mammals. Dreaming animals have mental languages. Consciousness, Anna Kantavad says to that, consciousness is such a vast concept that I think that to put it down to chemistry is just as much a leap of faith as a super being created it. I'm not kidding when I say this, by the way. I don't believe a God zapped consciousness into being, but I see no evidence that it came about chemically. Argument from ignorance would be an optimistic assessment of the consciousness from chemistry position, as there is no evidence for it at all. To which I said, came from? Does it come from chemistry? Do you mean the physical world, including things we don't understand, or you don't understand how it comes from things in our current understanding of chemistry? Don't you think I can say it's something in the physical world that causes or expresses it? And Anna Kantavad says, I think we could say that it may be a product of the physical universe. Yes, it may even be a product of our brain chemistry, but may isn't even a guess at likelihood. I don't question the chemical explanation because I think it's bogus, but rather because I think it just might close the mind to other explanations, if indeed explanation is the right word. To which I said, I don't think any possible explanation should close other explanations. I know it does for human beings, but I don't look at it that way. I try to collect as many explanations as possible. But it seems that by definition it must be something in the physical world which includes everything that interacts with us, by which I'm implicitly or perhaps I guess you could say explicitly proposing the definition of existence, which is my definition of existence is I think we start from this perceptual phenomena. It exists, that is what exists. Anything that comes through that and interacts with us then exists in some way or another. It could be a fantasy, but it exists as such because it interacts with something that exists. To which Anakanavad replies, maybe. But I think that we need to determine how much of the physical universe is a creation of consciousness. The obvious illustration is any man-made object. A Zippo isn't phenomenally a Zippo. It's just a jumble of matter and energy, and its Zippo-ness is something I project onto it. Even its itness is, in a way, artificial, another imposition. How much of the physical universe is similar to that? By the way, I'm out of my depth in physics and biology, and that's probably obvious by now. Okay, so the thing is, this was the whole point of my Cartesian holodeck thing. Everything is a recreation. That it's out there interacting with this robot body that we're connected to somehow, that we think our mentality is in that robot, that's what I think. All of that doesn't change the fact that we are existing in this three-dimensional holodeck recreation that our brain creates out of our sense perceptions, and in fact all of our perceptions, all our moods and everything else gets put onto this spatial projection, this metaphor, this idea of space our brain is able to conceive of. You understand this idea of space that we have, that's just our brain conceives of it that way. There's other ways to conceive of it. Coax says, seems to me all creations of consciousness are rehashes of physical things. It's just the brain isn't limited to having to create it as a real object. Zippo is a Zippo because our brain combines the physical properties like lighting a fire, metal, the letter Zippo, and so on. It can see the context of the actions in the object and also associate it with other things. The center of everything seems to be the ability to associate, which is hardwired in the brain's physical form. So this is the Stoic, and by the way, if I speak bluntly somehow or something, I mean, no offense, I'm very interested in this, so all praise to Coax and Anakanavad, but I just want to speak freely. And here is where I start to see the aspect that made me want to make this video, which is a sort of a Stoic urge to justify why the things that we think are accurate, right? Not just accurate, but they're real. They correspond to real categories, like the idea of natural kinds, that there are real categories in nature, and we try to find out those real categories. It's not like we just invent it. See, to me, I think our categories are just like a filing cabinet. We can have files that are by alphabet, by the name, by the type of project. You can file a lot of different ways. You can't say one way to file is fundamentally better. You could say one works better depending on what you use the files for, because that becomes an engineering problem where you can measure how much work doing what you want to do with that file arrangement is. Okay. Anakanavad says, yes, but that doesn't alter the fact that a Zippo doesn't phenomenally exist. So this is interesting. He's catching what I'm saying about all things about the Zippo. If a Stone Age human found a piece of flint shaped like a knife and proceeded to use it as a knife, at what point did it cease to be a piece of flint and become a knife? Okay. It never did that. That's not how classification works. Right? This is not how classification works. Here's me answering that way down here. Let's see if I follow this down. I said those types of questions are obsolete, I think. It never is any of those classifications. The question you ask is really, in what meaning it could be rephrased as, in what circumstances do I classify it as a knife, and which do I classify it as a piece of flint? At which point is a church, and at which is it a pile of bricks? Saying something is X means you can classify it as X and use X-related reasoning on it, but it doesn't mean it fundamentally has Xness. But Coax had said earlier, good question. I think the knife is always the same. It's just a piece of matter interacting with other matter. Then a brain can come around to assign it meaning based on its internal neural structure. So the knife and the brain are isolated and separate. The knife concept will be a set of patterns by the neurons that follow their own physical nature. I'm not sure how to explain the notion I'm having about the brain and consciousness, though. It's tricky. It is, but that particular statement, by the way, I totally agree with. It's just a bunch of atoms. You can use it a certain way, so you can think of it a certain way. Anaconavad says, see, that's where I wonder about the physical universe. How much of it is in the exact same place as the flint and knife? The caveman imposes kniveness onto what has for eons been nothing more than a rock. How much of the entire physical universe has its nature imposed on it by consciousness and not the other way around? All of it. All of so-called nature is imposed on the thing. Oh, but it does have interactions. Yeah, it has patterns of interaction with the material world. That's not imposed on it, but that's not a part of its quote-unquote nature. That's part of its behavior. See, nature is this is kind of verb, this category error that things are a certain way. In reality, they interact a certain way, and they don't repeat their interactions exactly. So you have to analyze it with different tools than you use when you have, atomic units, monads, or what have you. So Coax says, interesting and hard to say. My impulse would be to say any physical thing that is assembled or altered as a result of a brain seeing a possibility for its use are the ones imposed. Anything else simply labeled with language is not imposed by the brain. See, no. They're all imposed. They're all imposed. And we know this from the weird nature of physics now, that things are these bundles of weird energy. They don't have to be seen the way we see them. So even a natural category that all humans would go, well, of course, it makes sense to identify the apple as separate from the tree. Okay, that's just because we all have the same DNA and our brains approach pattern recognition with something received from evolution that's all quite similar for all of us. It's like a sequence. Object perceived by the brain, brain processes, brain controls body to create new objects. The tricky part is how objects trigger changes in the brain like a feedback loop, even when the point of creating awareness. What I like about the way Coax is thinking is he's talking about how, at least implicitly to me, how senses generate consciousness, and some other people have been discussing this. Because I think basically our perceptions come through temperatures on the skin, the light, the sound, emotions. Okay, we feel them come into our body. I believe that they all ultimately come from the outside, and then processing. And so basically it's a lot like the energy of the brain. The food we eat is there to power the amplifiers. The real energy that makes the brain change are these perceptions, which get amplified and sent through the brain. The brain reacts, and yeah, that is sort of pushing the process. That's shaping our environment. A part of our consciousness is our environment because so much of our consciousness is our stream of perceptions. What makes us seem so intelligent, I think, compared to a lot of animals and creatures, is our ability to defer this process, to feed it round and round and round, and not be so instantly driven, right? Like flies have circuits that when a shadow falls on their eyes, they fly away just like a knee-jerk reaction, right? Like a reflex. It skips around any higher thinking. It's just like that makes them do that. And it makes, so there's impulses wired straight into the motor system in all animals, including humans. But we have, compared to a lot of animals, we seem to have maximized deferring that automatic impulse. So more of our impulses can be judged before turned into behavior. Anaconavad says, anything else simply labeled with language is not imposed by the brain. Quote, not sure of that. How many things have an actual existence in themselves? Who says matter or energy aren't just functions of everything else? A few people already say they are, and what does that do to the existence of literally everything in the universe? Coax says it's a tricky thing. I think the objects we have in our mind are select aspects of the much more complex physical world, and that they exist as a consequence of how the neocortex primarily organizes and also the range of our senses. The actual reality is both enormous and incredibly small in scale and almost impossible to define precisely without cutting it up into distinct pieces, which our brain does, I'd argue. So this is fine. This is a classical idea of a way of saying, okay, the brain can't have all the details, but the ones it gets are correct. That's like saying an approximation is correct insofar as it goes. Yeah, exactly. That's what we're dealing with in statistical analysis of reality. A lot of approximations with estimates about how accurate they are. Anaconavad says, organization is something that is definitely an imposition. It's a concept, and concepts do not exist outside our minds. Okay. Down here, I'll skip, still in this thread, Anaconavad, who said, never mind a computer. Let's say it's Ridley Scott's Los Angeles of 2017 and we've created replicants. How would we know if they're conscious? We can observe what they do and listen to what they say. Does that prove consciousness? And I'll point out, look, because of the fact that we can't, there are no true categories. So is it truly conscious? Is never a question that would be answered. So what we need to do is just like, is it truly living? Does it count as living? We don't need some metaphysical, well, because it might act living, but did God breathe into it? What we're talking about is categories that we will continue to state explicit conscious criteria for putting them in and out. So I said, there's that word prove again. You can't prove you are conscious to yourself. What you do is experience your consciousness and you name it. Same with anything else. I've experienced aspects of my dog's conscious thoughts. Might I be mistaken? Yes, but no more so than about you having conscious thoughts. Right? So we start to create these categories, and we have, even though I'm the only one that can feel my subjective first-person stream of consciousness, I'm the only one that can feel that, but I'm not the only one that behaves with intention. There's other reasons that I end up putting myself in the categories with the other people, other creatures, that then could, there's more than one reason to put them in the set, and the set might have quality of consciousness. And why we might expect that? Well, because looking at the material world and how people are reproduced, we see we all have very similar brains. If my brain creates a phenomenon, and I talk to a lot of other people and they report the same phenomena, it's not a big guess to go, well, yeah, that's quite possible or even likely, because it's the same reason we all have DNA in common. Okay, and down here again I had said all identity is imposed by the process of identification. There are no natural kinds, and to the degree there might be said to be natural kinds, they are not classical categories. They do not follow transitive or associative rules, nor the law of the excluded middle. And to coax, I said, yes, there's no such thing as a perfectly valid classification. It's just a container logic, and you put lots of things in lots of containers. All classification is a cognitive phenomena. There are no categories in nature, in my opinion. And then what I had read at the beginning was that it's an obsolete type of question. And then I asked, do you think there are natural kinds to Anakanavad? I don't think a tomato has tomato-ness any more than a Zippo has lighterness. Those are all just structures we project on something to think of it as if. Like an actor can act as if a piece of plastic fruit is a real fruit. We act like one tomato is like the class tomato so we can eat it and think we're eating just another tomato. This fails when the tomato is rotten or poison or plastic. And Anakanavad says, I agree that it ceases to be a tomato in the edible category, but we have a backup category in position for what it has become. I take some sweet grapes and they go off. I've now got some wine or vinegar or just rotten furry grapes. It's still an imposition. Yeah, I think I've been saying that we impose the categories. And the solution to, oh, it's so arbitrary, is every categorization you can think of. Impose them all and triangulate. Get a web. Don't think any of them are what God told you the proper filing system is. Just try all the filing systems you can. You find some are useful in some situations. There's situations where they overlap, and thinking about all that creates new classifications and new ways to classify. And right now, I mean, we already have new interesting mathematics of classifications from topology and various things that are not the classical first order logic classifications. Instead you have example cases, epitomes, core cases, and metaphoric what am I trying to say, replacements, where you take a metaphor and take one element out of the metaphor and change it to fit the space you're mapping it to. There's ways to get this pattern of connections without saying that it always has to end with this sharp circle. All right, cheers.